Listening to the BBC, coming to you live from London. I'm Razia Iqbal and this is NewsHour. Here in the UK, an all-party parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism was set up following a rise in incidents during July and August last year during Israel's bombardment of Gaza. The MPs now say those social media users spreading racial hatred should be banned from sites such as Twitter and Facebook. But just how difficult is it to police racial hatred? We brought together Rachel Shabi, author of Not the Enemy, Israel's Jews from Arab Lands, and Jonathan Sacerdoti, Director of Communications from the Campaign Against Antisemitism UK. Does he agree with the recommendations?
We do welcome some of the recommendations in this report, but we're also concerned that some of them should not be the limit of what we see happening. In particular, we look at the recommendation that there should be more government money set aside for guarding of synagogues. And we think it's very important that this money being put aside should absolutely be reflected in increased policing so that we can see a very robust response from the government and the police itself in a way that sends a clear message to the whole nation that this isn't being left to Jewish people to defend themselves, albeit with government money, but actually the police itself are going to have an increased presence and be doing a better job of guarding Jewish places.
Rachel Shabi, what's your view of this? Do you think that the prevention orders, which is the kind of thing that the MPs who are looking into this issue are suggesting, might be the way to go forward, to actually stop people from engaging in racial hatred on Twitter, on Facebook, on social media platforms?
I mean, I'm not sure that's necessarily the appropriate response. I think the report is going to look into the feasibility of using that response, which has been used at the moment to deal with sex offenders and extend its application. But I do think what's important that's come up in this report, and the Community Standards Trust looked into the rise of anti-Semitic incidents in the UK, which has doubled and is at the highest point ever. And it reported that the spike in incidents is very much to do with what's going on in Israel. So I think one of the important things, and the report has alluded to this, is to look at the way that conversations are had around the Jewish community in the UK and what the actions of Israel. And some of that might be to redefine and make people re-aware, if you like, of what anti-Semitism means. But some of that is also about encouraging us not to conflate Jewishness with being anti-Israel.
Jonathan Sacerdoti, this is a very, very important point, isn't it? Because the spike came in July and August last year during the fighting between Gaza and Israel. And in fact, the inquiry was set up in the immediate aftermath of that, because that was seen to be an issue where you did see the hashtag Hitler was right trended worldwide in July 2014. Incredibly shocking and hurtful for anybody to read. Do you accept that there are circumstances where the impact of external events make it really difficult to predict the way in which this sort of speech can be monitored or policed?
What I would say about correlations like the one you're talking about in data that look like the causes from something going on in Israel is simply that when we look at the Community Security Trust's data released last week, we can see that they mentioned that in something like half of the incidents, Gaza was mentioned. Now, that's half of incidents which are classified as anti-Semitic. So what we're really seeing there is not that those actions in Israel caused anti-Semitism, but that if one is going to express anti-Semitic views, some people believe that adding the word Gaza to them will somehow get them off the hook. And we can't tolerate that sort of thing.
Rachel Shabi, what do you mean when you talk about the re-awareness, the kind of framing the conversation differently when there are external events that prompt people to comment in a negative way on social media?
Well, I think that part of what Jonathan is saying is absolutely right, that there are people who will use sentiments about Israel as a vehicle to express anti-Semitism that they would hold anyway. And we do need to have a conversation about, people are saying things without perhaps realizing that actually they are anti-Semitic. So we do need to revisit that. But at the same time, we do need to make it very clear that being critical of Israel is not the same as anti-Semitism. And I would also add that this conversation is also just as applicable to anti-Muslim sentiment and the tendency to blame Muslims everywhere for the actions carried out by a few, radical people claiming to speak on their behalf. So, there's actually a lot of commonality in the hate that we see against both communities.
There is, however, a certain difference between the two things. And I think part of the problem with how the government, the police and the Crown Prosecution Service are going to treat all forms of racism is that when we lump them all together in one thing, we deny that they have any unique features.
And is there a balance that needs to be struck in terms of freedom of speech or not when it comes to this specific type of commentary on racial hatred issues?
Well, that's exactly why I brought in the issue about being critical of Israel, because it is important to make the distinction between people who are quite legitimately making criticisms of Israel and people who are quite clearly being anti-Semitic. Now, being anti-Semitic is unequivocal. There is, we don't tolerate any sort of racial hatred, and obviously, freedom of speech is not an excuse for any kind of racial hatred.
Jonathan Sacerdoti, do you accept that distinction that Rachel Shabi's making about criticism of Israel being lumped in with the anti-Semitic comments, and that shouldn't be allowed to happen because criticism of Israel is perfectly legitimate?
Of course, it's vital that we should be able to have legitimate debate about any foreign policy issue anywhere in the world. But of course, what puts that at risk most is tolerating anti-Semites within that legitimate debate and allowing them to use that legitimate debate as some sort of veil or fig leaf for their thoroughly obnoxious, illegal and harmful racist views.
And is it also important to both of you, Rachel Shabi first, to try and unpick where it is that the anti-Semitism is coming from? Is it coming from far-right groups? Is it coming from what we've already talked about, the impact of external events? Is it coming from Muslims? Where is it specifically coming from? Is it possible to unpack that?
I think that, especially when it comes to attacks from the far right doesn't really care whether its target is Muslim or Jewish. At the moment, its target is more Muslim because that is more socially acceptable, if you like. But actually, I do think that Jewish and Muslim communities need to work very carefully together and identify, a common enemy there.
And I would go one step further on that, which is to say another common enemy of the majority of Muslims and Jewish people are those within the Muslim community who are anti-Semitic. And that is something that I do think we need to be able to have conversation about.
That was Jonathan Sacerdoti from Campaign Against Anti-Semitism and author Rachel Shabi. That's all for this edition of NewsHour. I'll be back again tomorrow. Hope you'll join me then.